So, having studied induction and deduction in the process of science, let's take an example and let's use Darwin's theory of evolution as an example of inductive and deductive reasoning. Let's proceed to that. So let's tackle Darwin. So, as you know from basic high school biology, evolution is a modification of a species over evolutionary time, over eons of time. And Darwin used the phrase to describe this as descent with modification, that organisms change over time, and that this is largely brought about by a force that Darwin discovered called natural selection. Darwin was really the first to provide a detailed description of what this force might be. And as you know, natural selection is really the differential reproductive fitness of organisms. Those organisms that are carrying adaptations that allow them to produce more offspring will pass those traits that allowed them to produce more offspring on to future generations more than other organisms will. And this will drive evolutionary change, that will drive descent with modification over eons. So one piece of one piece of evidence that prompted inductive reasoning for Darwin was his observation that species were very closely similar, and this suggested a relationship of those species. So, for example, on the Galapagos Islands, Darwin's famous finches on the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noted that on different islands, finches, all belonging to the finch family, would have certain similarities, but would also have certain differences. And he posited, he thought that these differences might be brought about by the local habitats having different environments on different islands. And it brought up it suggested to Darwin, after he thought about it, analyzed his data for many years, it suggested to Darwin that these different birds, these different finches, these different species of finches may all have arisen from a common ancestor, and that descent with modification on the various Galapagos Islands yielded these different species with different adaptations to their local environments. This was a good example of inductive reasoning. Darwin made observations on these finches, and he induced a theory that posited that these were all related in evolutionary time, that there was a common ancestor, let's say, and that ancestor gave rise to different species that are related through their common ancestry. And this is essentially Darwin's theory of evolution, that we get descendant species, species 1, species 2, species 3, from a common ancestor. That is, what we have is evolution. Another piece of Darwin's induction is that, another piece of Darwin's induction is that is the use of the observation made by Thomas Malthus, an economist, that organisms reproduce at a rate which is geometric, which increases exponentially. If you have two individuals, each of which produce two offspring, and each of those two offspring produce two more, you will have growth in the population that is geometric, there's exponential growth. Whereas if you look at the food supply available to any organisms, the growth of the food supply is not exponential, but is rather arithmetic. And therefore, Darwin induced that that this differential would create what he termed a struggle for existence. Given limited resources, not all offspring in a population will survive and reproduce with equal efficiency. And therefore, those organisms that are carrying traits that allow them to survive better or to produce more offspring than their neighbors or than their compatriots, those will pass on those traits and therefore drive evolution. And so Darwin used Malthus's ratios of geometric growth of populations versus arithmetic growth of food supplies and resources to induce support for his theory of evolution, his theory of descent with modification being driven by natural selection, given the struggle for existence that these graphs imply. Now let's move on to deductive evidence. So moving from inductive evidence to deductive evidence. Of course, Darwin had many more examples of induction that led him to his theories. We just aren't going to cover them right now. First of all, deductive evidence, which are in a way tests of Darwin's theory. Deductive evidence comes from the fossil record. New fossils are being found all the time, and the Earth is even older than Darwin had previously believed. And this is key because the geological analysis of the Earth places the Earth at about 4.5 billion years old. Very, very long time that the Earth has been in existence. And this provided evolutionary theory with the time it needs to produce the changes that would be needed to produce all the biological organisms that we see in today's world. Furthermore, the evidence for relatedness among organisms, that descent with modification from common ancestors, is derived from lots of paleontological fossil evidence. And if Darwin only knew today the fossil evidence that we have, if that had been available to him, he would have been thrilled, because this is strong confirmatory evidence of his descent, of his theory of descent with modification. So these two features, to name a couple, are very good deductive evidences that allow confirmation of hypotheses that Darwin's theory posits. Furthermore, Darwin did not really understand, when he came up with his theory, the mechanisms of heredity, the mechanisms of genetics. He desperately wanted to understand those because he knew that his theory needed a way to pass on adaptive traits from parent to offspring to grand offspring down the line. Yet Darwin didn't understand the laws of heredity. And when Mendel came along, that provided a very nice understanding of the mechanism by which Darwinian adaptive traits could be passed on. And it provided a means by which families that carried traits which allowed them to be more reproductively fit than other families would pass those features on to future generations. So both of these are very strong deductive evidence in favor of Darwin's theory, and support this theory strongly, more strongly than Darwin could ever have imagined in his time. Now at this point, let's take a little breather here and talk about basically a natural selection primer. What is evolution and natural selection? And this is by way of review, with a modern understanding of Darwinian evolution. So mutations, that is the versions of genes that provide for differential reproductive fitness, that cause some organisms to be more successful and more efficient at producing offspring and therefore passing on genes to future generations. Mutations and the combinations of those mutations, and therefore the production of new varieties of organisms, those do not arise because they are needed. They arise simply by chance. This is our modern genetic understanding of the nature of genetic mutations, which provide the raw material for evolution, to the raw material that natural selection needs to drive evolution. So mutations don't arise because they are needed. They arise by chance. What do we mean by that exactly? Let's use an example. Let's say that an ice age is occurring, and those organisms that are living in northern climes will leave more offspring if we're talking about mammals, if their fur is thicker or longer, providing needed conservation of body heat that would allow them to produce or put more effort into reproduction and leaving offspring. So longer fur in cold climates yields more offspring because more energy can be invested in those offspring instead of just trying to stay warm. So do mutations which lead to longer fur, thicker coats that would protect against the cold, do those mutations of longer fur in the cold climates arise because they're needed in the cold climate? No, it's not that. They arise by chance alone. They arise by chance, but those organisms that possess those mutations and therefore do grow longer fur or thicker fur, and therefore do not need to invest as much energy in keeping warm as neighbors with shorter, thinner fur do. Because of that, they will pass those mutations for long fur on. Again, the long fur mutations, the thick fur mutations, do not arise because they are needed. They arise by chance. And then natural selection comes into play because natural selection will allow those organisms that have long fur genes to pass more copies of those genes on than organisms that are bearing thin fur genes. Another feature about mutations, another modern understanding of the basis of the varieties that natural selection acts upon, another feature of mutations is that they just furnish the random raw material for evolution. They don't determine the course of the process. This is another way of saying what determines the course of the process is natural selection. Natural selection operates on the genetic variation produced by mutations and the combinations of those mutations in different organisms. And therefore we can say that natural selection is the differential reproduction of genotypes, of combinations of genes, in other words. And that cumulative selection over many generations is a constructive force. And this force has been observed in action many times by evolutionary biologists in many different contexts. We don't have time to go into those and for this lecture. You'll get more of that as you study more biology. But the power of cumulative selection acting over eons can be a very powerful constructive force. Consider the peacock's gorgeous tail. This has evolved over long periods of evolutionary time. And that is, if you consider the construction of those elaborate tails in peacocks, driven by natural selection, you can see immediately that you can appreciate some of the constructive force that natural selection can bring to bear on the evolution of organisms. And then quite simply then, evolution is the change in the genetic composition of populations over time, driven originally by genetic variation, acted upon by natural selection, resulting in changes in the genetic composition of populations over time, that is, changes in the organisms over time. So let's talk about some more deductive evidence that supports Darwin's theory. This comes from the field of comparative anatomy. And we're going to introduce two terms here, homologous structures and analogous structures. So considering the anatomy of organisms, comparative anatomy, looking at structures, we see that certain structures in related organisms have the same evolutionary origin, but might have a different structure and function. That is to say, if we consider some structure in some ancestor here, we might find that in descendant species, species 1, species 2, that there has been evolution and change in those structures in the descendant species from this common ancestor. And we say then that those structures found in species 1 and species 2 are homologous structures in that they have a common ancestor. We'll get to a specific example in a moment. Whereas analogous structures have very similar structure and function, but different evolutionary origins. And let's use an example now to illustrate these differences in structures that we term homologous and analogous in comparative anatomy, and consider how that provides deductive evidence for the theory of evolution.